My husband asked for a DNA test after 10 years of marriage, and the strange part is how quiet it was. No shouting, no slammed doors, no wild accusations flying across the room. He stood near the kitchen counter, holding a thin white envelope like it weighed more than it should, and he looked tired. Not angry, just tired. His voice didn't shake when he spoke. He said it carefully, like he was choosing each word so it wouldn't cut too deep. "I think we should be sure," he said. That was it. No explanation, no follow-up, just that sentence hanging in the air between us. I remember how the house sounded at that moment. The hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking on the wall. Our child was laughing softly in the other room, unaware that something invisible had just cracked open. I stared at my husband's face, searching for something familiar, some hint of the man I thought I knew, but all I saw was distance. It felt like standing on solid ground and suddenly realizing it was thin ice. I wanted to ask him what he meant, why now, what had changed, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like if I spoke, everything would spill out at once. 10 years disappeared in that silence. All the conversations we'd had, all the promises we'd made, all the nights we'd fallen asleep believing we were safe with each other. And in their place was this one quiet request that somehow sounded louder than any accusation. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, just a piece of paper and a sentence, could make my entire life feel like it was suddenly up for debate. As he stood there waiting for my response, my mind started moving faster than my body could keep up. 10 years together came rushing back, not in order, but in flashes. Our first tiny apartment where the heat barely worked in winter. Late nights, eating cheap takeout on the floor because we didn't own a table yet. The way he used to reach for my hand in crowded places, like he was afraid of losing me. These memories didn't feel distant or faded. They felt sharp, almost painful, because they all pointed to one question I couldn't understand. How did we get here? We had built a life the slow way. Not perfectly, but honestly, or at least that's what I believed. We celebrated promotions and survived layoffs. We argued about money and made up in the dark. We sat in hospital waiting rooms, holding hands so tight our fingers went numb. When our child was born, I watched him cry for the first time, overwhelmed and terrified and proud all at once. That memory replayed itself now, over and over, like proof I was silently offering to the universe. This is real. This is ours. And yet, in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. 10 years didn't protect us from doubt. A decade of shared history suddenly felt fragile, like it could be questioned, tested, or dismissed with paperwork. I kept wondering what I had missed. Was there a moment when trust quietly slipped through our fingers and neither of us noticed? Or was this something new, something that had crept in when I wasn't looking? I felt like I was standing in the middle of our marriage, watching it shrink down to a single moment, a single question, a single choice I hadn't asked for. Everything we'd built felt like it was balancing on the edge of that envelope in his hand, and I had no idea which way it was about to fall. I couldn't stop staring at the envelope. It was plain, nothing special about it, but it felt like the most important object in the room. He held it carefully, not crumpled, not folded, like he respected it. That detail hurt more than I expected. It made the request feel planned, thought through, not emotional or impulsive. This wasn't something he blurted out in a fight. This was something he had decided quietly, long before telling me. I wanted to ask him where it came from, who gave it to him, how long he'd been carrying it around before working up the courage to say something. But I didn't. Part of me was afraid of the answers, and part of me didn't want to hear him explain himself yet. I was still trying to understand what that paper said about me, about us. It felt like a question mark, stamped over my entire existence as a wife and a mother. He kept looking at me like he was waiting for permission, or forgiveness, or maybe even relief. I couldn't tell. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. In my head, I kept repeating the same thought. If you trust someone, you don't need proof. And if you need proof, something is already broken. That realization settled heavy in my chest. I noticed how calm he was, and that scared me. Anger would have made sense. Accusations would have been easier to fight. But this quiet certainty, this careful approach, made it feel like he had already crossed some invisible line on his own. Like he had already decided that doubt was reasonable. And now all that was left was for me to react to a choice he'd already made. I expected to feel angry. I expected heat in my chest, sharp words on my tongue, the urge to defend myself loudly. But none of that came. What I felt instead was confusion, heavy and disorienting, like waking up in a room you don't recognize. I kept thinking there must be some misunderstanding, some detail missing that would make this make sense if I could just find it. Then came the shame, quiet and unwelcome. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because being questioned like that makes you feel exposed in a way that's hard to explain. Like your truth suddenly needs approval. I wondered if this was how people feel when they realize someone they love doesn't see them the same way anymore. When trust shifts from something given freely to something that has to be earned again, I stayed silent longer than I should have. He watched me closely, maybe expecting tears or outrage, but all I could manage was a slow breath. I didn't want to give him a reaction he could use to justify the doubt. I didn't want to become defensive, because even that felt like it would somehow confirm his fear. So I stood there, holding myself together, feeling smaller by the second. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. If he could question this, what else had he questioned? How long had this doubt lived in his head before it reached his lips? I realized in that moment that anger would have been easier. Anger fades, confusion lingers. And as I looked at the man I'd shared my life with, I felt the unsettling sense that something fundamental had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to find my footing again. From the corner of my eye, I could see the doorway to the living room, where our child was playing on the floor. Small sounds drifted in, the soft clatter of toys, a quiet hum that meant everything was still okay in that room. That contrast almost broke me. In the kitchen, our marriage felt like it was cracking open, but just a few steps away, innocence was untouched by doubt. I looked at my husband, then back toward the doorway, and a question echoed in my mind that I didn't say out loud. What does this do to a child? Not the test itself, but the feeling behind it. The idea that love can suddenly come with conditions, that belonging might need proof. I thought about all the times we'd promised to protect our family, to be a team, to face the world together. None of those promises mentioned this. I felt a deep ache settle in my chest as I realized how fragile safety really is. Our child trusted us completely, trusted that the two people in their world were solid, certain, unshakable. And here we were, standing in silence, letting doubt creep into the foundation of everything we were supposed to be building. That's when it hit me that this moment wasn't just about a test. It was about what happens when uncertainty enters a home quietly, when questions are asked without thinking about the echoes they leave behind. I didn't know what the result of any test would be yet, but I already understood something painful and clear. No matter what that paper said, something had already changed. And the hardest part was knowing that our child would feel it too, even if they never heard a single word of this conversation. Later that night, after the house went quiet, a memory surfaced that I hadn't thought about in years. At the time, it felt small, almost forgettable. We were sitting at the kitchen table, years ago, talking about nothing important. I remember mentioning a coworker in passing, someone I barely knew, and noticing the way my husband's expression changed. It was subtle, just a pause, a tightness around his eyes. He laughed it off, made a joke, and the moment passed. Or so I thought. Back then, I didn't question it. Why would I? Trust was automatic. I assumed that if something bothered him, he'd say it. That was how we worked, or at least how I believed we did. But now, replaying that memory, it felt different. It felt like a hairline crack, one that didn't shatter anything right away, but quietly existed beneath the surface. I started wondering how many moments like that I'd missed. How many times had doubt brushed past us without either of us naming it? Trust doesn't usually break all at once. It weakens slowly, through unspoken thoughts and swallowed questions. Sitting alone in the dark, I realized that whatever led to the DNA test didn't begin that day in the kitchen. It had roots, and those roots went deeper than I wanted to admit. Looking back, the past year felt different, even before the test entered our lives. He wasn't cruel or distant in an obvious way. It was quieter than that. Conversations ended sooner. Laughter didn't linger. He seemed distracted, like part of him was always somewhere else. I told myself it was stress, work, exhaustion. Life does that to people. Marriage goes through seasons. But there were moments that stood out now. The way he'd ask questions twice, as if checking my answers. The way he'd go silent when I talked about my day. How he'd watch me sometimes, not warmly, but thoughtfully, like he was trying to solve something. At the time, I brushed it off. I didn't want to turn normal distance into something darker by overthinking it. Now, those memories lined up differently. They felt like puzzle pieces I hadn't known I was collecting. I started to see that his doubt didn't appear out of nowhere. It had been growing quietly, feeding on assumptions and unanswered questions. And while I'd been living our life as usual, believing in us without hesitation, he'd been slowly pulling away, building a wall I didn't even know was there. There was one question that kept circling in my head, growing louder every hour, but I couldn't bring myself to ask it. Why now? Not why a test exists, not how it works, but why, after 10 years, after everything, did he suddenly need certainty? The timing felt heavy, like it carried a meaning I wasn't ready to face. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, I imagined the answer might hurt more than the question. What if someone had put the idea in his head? What if he'd been listening to voices outside our marriage instead of talking to me? Or worse, what if this doubt had been living inside him for years, hidden behind routines and smiles. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was afraid of what the truth might change. Asking that question felt like opening a door I might not be able to close again. So instead, we existed in this strange pause, both of us avoiding the real conversation, pretending that silence was safer than honesty. But silence has its own weight. It presses down on you, fills the space where trust used to live. And deep down, I knew that the longer I avoided asking why, the more power the question had over me. The days that followed felt unreal, like we were acting out a version of our life instead of actually living it. We talked about schedules, meals, errands, all the small practical things that keep a household running, but everything else stayed untouched. The test sat between us, invisible but solid, shaping every interaction. I noticed how careful we became around each other. Our words were polite, measured, stripped of warmth. We avoided eye contact more than we should have. Even the way we moved around the house felt different, like we were sharing space but not connection. I started to miss him even though he was right there. At night, the distance felt wider. We lay in the same bed, facing opposite directions, pretending sleep came easily. I kept thinking about how strange it was that a piece of paper had so much power. Not because of what it might say, but because of what it represented. Doubt had taken up residence in our home, and neither of us knew how to ask it to leave. I realized then that tests don't just measure truth, they measure fear. And the fear was already doing damage, regardless of any result. Whatever answer came later, the waiting itself was carving something away from us, one quiet moment at a time. People talk about accusations like they're loud and dramatic, full of yelling and slammed doors. But no one talks about the quiet ones, the ones wrapped in calm voices and reasonable language. Those are the ones that sink deeper, because they don't give you something clear to fight against. Being questioned like that changes how you see yourself. I started replaying my own memories, not because I doubted them, but because I wondered how they looked through his eyes. I felt the strange urge to justify my past, my choices, my entire life, even though I knew I shouldn't have to. That's what doubt does. It makes you defend truths that were never in question before. What hurt most wasn't the idea that he didn't trust me completely. It was realizing how lonely that doubt felt. Trust is something you build together, but suspicion isolates you. It puts you on opposite sides, even when neither of you wants to be there. By then, I understood something important. This wasn't just a moment we'd move past once the test was done. Something deeper had been exposed. And whether we admitted it or not, we were already standing in the aftermath of a question that couldn't be taken back. There was a night when we almost talked. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the TV on but muted, both of us pretending to watch. I could feel the words building in my chest, pressing upward, begging to be spoken. I wanted to ask him what he was really afraid of. I wanted to tell him how much this silence was hurting me. I wanted to remind him of who we were before doubt entered the room. He shifted beside me, took a breath, and for a moment, I thought he was about to say something real. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked away, and just like that, the moment passed. We returned to small talk, safe topics, anything that didn't touch the wound between us. That almost conversation stayed with me. It haunted me more than an argument would have. It showed me how close we were to honesty, and how afraid we both were of what honesty might uncover. Sometimes the hardest moments aren't the fights you remember, but the truths you almost shared and didn't. That night, lying in bed next to him felt different than any night before. His breathing was familiar, steady, the same rhythm I'd fallen asleep to for years, but the comfort was gone. I felt like I was next to someone I didn't fully know anymore. Not because he'd changed completely, but because something inside him was hidden from me. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. I wondered how two people could share a bed and still feel so far apart. Love doesn't disappear overnight. It fades in moments like this, when closeness is replaced by caution. I realized then that trust isn't just about believing someone. It's about feeling safe enough to be fully seen. And in that bed, wrapped in silence, I didn't feel seen at all. The call came the next afternoon while I was folding laundry. I almost ignored it, distracted and tired, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, unfamiliar, and professional. They asked to confirm my name, then explained why they were calling. My heart started racing, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. There was information moving behind the scenes, decisions being made without me fully involved. When the call ended, I stood there holding my phone, staring at nothing, feeling like the ground had shifted slightly beneath my feet. For the first time since the test was mentioned, I felt something new enter the mix. Not fear, not confusion, but the sense that this story was bigger than the question my husband had asked me. That something else was at play, quietly shaping his doubt. After that call, small details I'd ignored before began to surface. Comments he'd brushed off, conversations he'd avoided, the way he'd seemed influenced by things outside our home. None of it meant anything on its own, but together, it formed a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. I started to see that his doubt might not have started with me at all. That thought hurt in a different way. It suggested that our marriage hadn't just been tested by suspicion, but by something allowed to grow unchecked. Something that fed on silence and distance. I didn't confront him yet. I needed to understand more, to steady myself before opening another difficult conversation. But deep down, I felt the shift. The story I'd been telling myself about that DNA test was incomplete, and the truth, whatever it was getting closer. When the results arrived, they didn't come with drama. No music, no dramatic pause. Just an email notification and a quiet moment where everything felt suspended. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, not because I feared the answer, but because I knew this wasn't the ending. It was only another turning point. I didn't open it right away. I sat there, breathing slowly, thinking about everything that had led us here. The silence, the doubt, the distance. I realized then that whatever those results said, they wouldn't fix what had already been broken. Because the real damage wasn't written in numbers or percentages. It was written in the space that had grown between two people who once trusted each other without question. And as I finally prepared myself to look at the results, one thing was clear. The hardest conversation was still ahead. I didn't bring up the results right away. We sat at the kitchen table again, just like the day he first asked for the test, the same quiet tension filling the space. I looked at him and realized something important. The question that mattered most wasn't about biology anymore. It was about trust. So instead of asking what the test said, I asked him something else. I asked him when he stopped believing me. The question surprised him. I could see it in his face. He hesitated, rubbed his hands together, and stared down at the table like the answer might be written there. That pause told me more than words ever could. It meant this doubt hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing, fed by something deeper than logic. I told him how lonely it felt to be questioned without being talked to. How painful it was to realize he'd carried this fear alone instead of letting me in. My voice stayed calm, but my chest ached as I spoke. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I just wanted the truth, even if it hurt. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I expected. He didn't blame me. He didn't accuse me. Instead, he talked about doubt, about how it creeps in slowly when you don't confront it. He admitted that outside voices had played a role, conversations that planted questions instead of answers. He said he should have talked to me sooner, before fear took control. Listening to him was painful in a different way. Not because he'd confessed to betrayal, but because he'd confessed to weakness. He'd let uncertainty grow without trusting me enough to bring it into the open. And that realization stung. I could see regret in his eyes, real and heavy. But regret doesn't erase damage, it only explains it. As he spoke, I understood that this wasn't about proving something on paper. It was about how easily trust can be shaken when communication stops. What hurt most wasn't that he asked for the test. It was that he doubted me quietly, on his own, without giving me the chance to stand beside him in that fear. Marriage, to me, had always meant facing uncertainty together. And somewhere along the way, we stopped doing that. I told him that trust isn't proven through tests. It's proven through conversations, through vulnerability, through choosing to believe in the person you committed your life to. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of a doubt that wasn't mine. That was the moment I realized how fragile love can be when it isn't protected. Not by control or certainty, but by honesty. And once honesty disappears, even briefly, the damage can echo far longer than anyone expects. Forgiveness didn't come instantly. I didn't offer it out of habit or fear. I took time to sit with everything I felt. Hurt, disappointment, love, all of it tangled together. I had to decide what this moment would become. A breaking point or a reckoning. I told him that rebuilding trust would take more than apologies. It would take openness, patience, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths together. I needed to know that doubt wouldn't be hidden again, that fear wouldn't be allowed to grow in silence. This wasn't about staying or leaving in a dramatic way. It was about choosing whether we were both willing to do the work honesty requires. And that choice belonged to both of us. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see in the beginning. This was never really about DNA. It was about what happens when trust is replaced with suspicion and silence takes the place of communication. The test didn't create the problem, it revealed it. Families aren't built on proof, they're built on belief. On the quiet decision, every day, to trust the person beside you even when fear whispers otherwise. When that belief wavers, the damage reaches far beyond any test result. What I learned is simple, but it isn't easy. Doubt doesn't need evidence to hurt, it only needs space to grow. And love, real love, needs honesty to survive. That was the real truth waiting to be uncovered, all along.